My name is Pauline, and thank you for coming to the webinar today. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Dr. Phyllis Lau. She's from the Western Sydney University and the University of Melbourne, Australia. She is the Director of the Cultural Respect Encompassing Simulation Training, otherwise known as CREST, and which is an innovative teaching and learning program that provides training in cultural sensitivity in communication. During this webinar, Phyllis will be drawing from her own experience living in multicultural Singapore and Australia, and she will provide the rationale for or stimulate your thinking about the necessity to face cultural competence as an issue. And so if you have any questions, please type it in the chat box, and Phyllis will answer your questions after her talk. Over to you, Phyllis.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and I really look forward to sharing some of my experiences with you. So let me first try to organize my slides. And once I have my slide in, just one moment. Let me see a share screen. Once I have my slide in my in the presentation mode, I actually can't see the Zoom at all because I'm using a single screen. So I'll rely on Pauline to tell me whether you and anyone needs to catch my attention desperately. So I hope you don't mind. And if you need to ask a question like desperately, please do just pipe up. So my name is Phyllis Lau, so thank you, Pauline, just now for that introduction. Are you seeing my screen now?
Yes,
wonderful. Prof. Good, excellent. I will put it on presentation mode. Oh, good. Oh, I actually can see you. Can you all see the little Zoom grid as well? You can? Can you see the Zoom grid, or you just see the PowerPoint sharing screen?
We can see we can see your face also, Prof.
You can see my face also.
Yeah. With the screen.
All right. So it's sorry, I was okay, good. So I actually can see a few of you. So let's start. When Pauline asked me to do this cultural competence webinar, some of you may know that I'm actually going to conduct 2 cultural competence workshops tomorrow. I was thinking like, oh goodness, how am I going to talk about the same thing again and again? There's only so many ways to talk about one thing, the cultural competence. So I thought maybe what I'll share with you is my own journey in this growth, my own journey and growth in this concept of cultural competence. That's why my title today is From Tolerance to Respect to Action. So firstly, what credentials do I have to be talking to you about cultural competence? Well, firstly, the minuses. I don't even have a social science background, so why am I exactly talking to you about this? What I have is my expertise is in primary care research. What I have is that I came from Singapore and lived in Australia, just shy of 40 years ago. And I have worked in the Indigenous health research in Australia since 2008. And I co-developed the CREST, which is Cultural Respect Encompassing Simulation Training Program at the University of Melbourne. I just want to make a correction just now with the introduction, Pauline. The CREST program has actually now no longer funded, so the program is no longer. But my experience obviously come from years of working in that program and developing it. Firstly, let us talk about multicultural Singapore, your neighbor, and my home country. These numbers came from the census 2020 a few years ago. About 3/4 of Singaporeans are ethnic Chinese, 14% and 10% are Malays and Indians. So we're pretty multicultural, and that's how I've always thought that I come from a very multicultural background. Now let's talk about multicultural Australia then. These numbers come from 2022. Our population in Australia is about 26 million. About 30% of our population were born overseas and identified with over 270 countries. And most of our overseas born residents come from UK, and then followed by India, China, and so on and so forth. And you can see Malaysia is one of those countries too. We have a lot of Malaysians in Australia. And when we talk about multicultural Australia, we always will mention the fact that Australia is home to one of the oldest living culture on earth, the Aboriginal culture. And in the 2021 ABS numbers, we have around about just shy of 900,000 Aboriginal Australians living in Australia. That is a very small percentage, around about 3.5%. So taking up not that much of the population, however, a very integral part of our. So okay. So some of you may be following Australian politics and all that. If you are, you will know that at the moment, the whole country is immersed in this thinking about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, what we call that. Because later in this year, all Australians, including myself, will be voting in a referendum about whether we need to change our constitution to recognize the first peoples of Australia by establishing this thing called the Aboriginal voice. The voice will be independent, and it will be a permanent advisory body that advises Australian Parliament and government about matters that affect the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, for those of you who may not know the Australian Aboriginal history and the long history of the conquer of the Europeans in the land of Australia and how Aboriginal people were treated, you may not totally understand this need for such a referendum in this age of 2023. But some of you may know that not until 1967, Australian Aboriginal people are not even counted by the census. They are regarded as indigenous for flora and fauna. In other words, parts of the indigenous flowers and animals, they're not counted as human. So I don't know, that is just one incident. I can give you many different stories and all that about, the stories about how Aboriginal Australians feel about about the standing in the Australian society. I'm not an Aboriginal person, so I can't speak for them, and I will not be. But I just want to give you a little bit of understanding of why it is such an important topic in that country. Does living, I thought I asked myself this question a lot. Does living in a multicultural country makes you naturally more culturally sensitive or competent? I want you all to think about that, because Malaysia is very multicultural too. The only answer to that question is no, it isn't. I'll just take Australia as example. I won't take Singapore or Malaysia. When surveyed, about 1 in 5 Australians say that they have experienced discrimination in their time in Australia because of their ethnicity, their religion, or their skin color. But the good thing is, of course, the majority of Australians support action to tackle racism. Cultural sensitivity and competence is really actually a process. None of us are born culturally sensitive, culturally competent. It is not a given. And for some people, that process is a lot longer than others. So it is very individualized, and it's not something to be expected. I certainly don't think so. So I live in Australia, and some of you may know that a few prime ministers ago, our prime minister at the time in late 1990s is John Howard. And in 1996, he issued a statement on multiculturalism, because at that time there was a movement to make Australia multicultural, and there was a lot of talk around multiculturalism, and also a lot of issues around racism started to surface. Now on the right-hand side, that's a statement that he made. he made. And as always, any politician is about how well their government is doing. The coalition is basically a coalition of the Liberal government and the National Party, which is more representing the regional Australia. So it talks about the work that coalition does, and he then talks about Australia being what sort of society it is, and the diversity that brings us together, and talks about how good our nation is in terms of being multicultural. What really caught me at the time, 1996, I was in Australia a number of years already. What caught me at the time was that statement: Australia is a tolerant, compassionate, and cohesive society. And what I couldn't understand at the time, and being a minority in Australia, it all of a sudden dawned on me that what is it about me that I needed to be tolerated? It took me a long time. I pondered on that word a lot, and it suddenly dawned on me that maybe what I thought when I thought I was accepted in my new country, I was maybe only being tolerated. And that troubled me a lot. That made me think a lot about my own actions when I was living all those years growing up in Singapore, and the way I would treat other cultural groups, other ethnicity, because I was a majority. I didn't need to think a lot about it. Luckily for us, I mean, lots of people have a bit of problem with that word tolerant. Luckily for us, John Howard, later in his address to the launch of the National Multicultural Advisory Council's issues paper, Multicultural Australia, the Way Forward, he made a bit of a clarification. He basically said, look, it's very important for us to take this opportunity to make a stand. He said that he still stuck to the word tolerance. Tolerance is a great quality, but in a sense, it's a passive thing. And he goes on to say, we believe in proactive embrace of the diversity of our community. We believe in sharing the values and reaping the dividend of our diversity. Now, that is so different to tolerance. At that time, I was already doing a lot of work in Indigenous health research. So by the very nature of Indigenous health research in Australia, there was a lot of I needed to watch very carefully around cultural competence and the need to be culturally sensitive. So I'm beginning to understand more and more about the importance of cultural competence. So let's define what is cultural competence. There's lots of definitions, and this is just one definition. Is basically the ability to successfully interact, understand, and communicate with people of cultures other than your own. Why is it important? Because we're living increasingly in community and in our personal life, in our professional life, in cross-cultural settings. We constantly have to be talking to people from different cultures, and therefore it is important for us to strive to be culturally competent. Now, this is a framework I like to use. Now, remember I said that cultural competence is a process of growth, is a process of growth. And Kambina Bukote, this framework or process of cultural competence, I like this very much. The mnemonic ASKED is what she says encompass the process of growing towards a cultural competence. So there is awareness of the culture, awareness of your own bias, the skill, the cultural competence skill that you need, the knowledge of the culture that you're interacting with. Importantly, encounters. Encounters are the opportunities that you have to interact with people of different cultural groups. And lastly, but not least, is the desire to want to be culturally competent. I always said to my students that ASKED, of all these, the easiest thing to achieve in all our lives, in everyone, is awareness. As long as you turn on the TV, as long as you read the paper, you will be aware of the cultural diversity around, or aware of your own biases. One of the hard things to achieve is actually skill. in cultural competency. That's why in University of Melbourne, particularly, and also Western Sydney University, we emphasize a lot on cultural competence skill of our medical students, and of course all other types of students. But I'm involved in the medical school, so that's what we have a lot of focus on. However, the cultural competence is a word that we've been using many years, and there are many slightly different variations of word. But not so much recently, in the last 8 to 10 years, I suppose, another word started creeping into this definition or this thinking about cultural competence, and it's the word cultural compatibility. Now, you might think, what on earth is that word? I'm not sure. I don't think you can find that word in the Oxford Dictionary. But cultural compatibility is defined as a synergistic, the synergism between cultural humility and cultural competence, in which the humility permeates that ASKED components of cultural competence. From this perspective, cultural compatibility then is seen as simultaneously being a process of growth to being culturally competent into more a process of being. It's very philosophical. I like this sort of thinking around why we do certain things. So it's not just a matter of doing, but it's a matter of thinking. It's a matter of thinking as well. So the in word now is cultural compatibility. So I thought I'll demonstrate this for you in a graphical way. So if you look at that ASKED, so culturally aware, you're knowledgeable, you become skilled, and have the opportunities to interact and practice, and you have the desire to do more, and you slowly grow in your cultural competence. But throughout all this, if you include cultural humility into this, then this whole thing then become a being of yourself. But the way I look at it, I look at it another layer, and yet another layer, further layer. Cultural humility and cultural competence are both very inward looking. So cultural humility is you being humble. Cultural competence is you being competent. I think it is time now to think of the next step, which is about cultural respect, which is a more an outward expression of our being into that, being respectful. And of course, none of this make any difference if it doesn't translate into action. Therefore, that's why my title, From Tolerance to Respect to Action. And if you think about what John Howard said, that highlighted what he said in the 1990s, late 1990s, he actually talked about that action. We proactively embrace diversity in our community. We share the values and we want to reap the dividend of our diversity. So I hope I bring across that cultural competence is really a thinking of philosophy where you can actually express it outwardly into a respect and action. I'm almost finished now. Towards the end, I want to say again that cultural competence is it's not a one-time finite achievement. It's actually a long process. Actually, it's a lifelong process. In this particular quote from the American National Council on Disability, they say that it would be dangerous for a person to think that they have learned everything that they need to learn and they are culturally competent, and no one can claim that. We are all in the process of cultural competence. I'd like to leave you with a couple more quotes. This one is from Thomas Jefferson. A very good quote of his is, "There is nothing more unequal than the equal treatment of unequal people." Now, I know some of you now are probably a little bit uneasy about the word used here, unequal people. So let us change that slightly for Tom. Let us say that there is nothing more unequal than the equal treatment of people with different needs. So especially those of you who might be healthcare providers, because I work in the medical faculty, so most of the talks like this, I aim at healthcare professionals. So that to treat our patients all the same is actually very inequitable. I'll leave you now with also another quote from someone maybe not as famous, but slowly growing in wisdom as well. When we talk about respecting each other, it does not actually require understanding or liking or agreeing, because that's what a lot of people say. Oh, I don't know what to do because I don't understand. You know, I don't even agree with what they do. It doesn't matter. That has got nothing to do with it. It does not focus on our similarities or differences. It's got nothing to do with that. It is about simply accepting cultural differences, even without fully understanding or liking or even agreeing. So I thought I'll leave you with that few quotes. And that concludes my very quick disposition about my own journey in my own journey of cultural competence. Thank you, Pauline. I'll stop share, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Phyllis, for that very interesting talk. And we actually have two questions in our chat. One is, I'll just read it out, Amir. He said, hi, it's a really interesting talk. What kind of content should be taught to students to develop their multicultural competence?
I think firstly, because I like I said, I teach a health professional type students, so I'll use that, but I think it can be translated to any type of students. I think firstly, to get them to be aware of their own cultural bias, or their own lack of awareness of their cultural bias. I remember in the beginning, I taught a group of nursing students, and in the nursing group there were some very multicultural. It's a very multicultural group in Australia, in the university, and there were Australians that were different from Asia country, and we asked them, do you feel that you have any issues around? Do you feel that you need to know about cultural competence? It is actually the local Australians who don't realize that they actually have any biases at all. They don't feel that they have. They don't feel that they are. They need to learn about cultural. Or they not that they don't care. It's that they're not aware of their own need to be understanding about culture, because they don't see themselves as a cultural group. I don't know whether you understand what I mean. So I said, I always gave an example of when I first went to Australia, the Australian culture is so different to what I was used to. Even the way they pronounce certain things, well, that's the least of the way they regard certain issues are so different to mine. So I think firstly is to get your student to understand their own biases or their own lack of awareness that they might even have biases. And then get them to understand that cultural competence is not a passive thing. That tolerance, as long as I don't actively participate in maybe racism or whatever, but it's more than passive. It's an active action. So I was to actually one of the slides I actually took away from this presentation is about how do you develop your own cultural competence. Firstly, to be open to what other cultural groups do, be open to the ideas and all that, to learn about other cultural groups. Whenever you have opportunity to mingle with people of different cultures, and but the last one is the hardest one. Is not hardest, but it's the most active one. Is to speak up when you see something is not right. Now, most people would choose to keep quiet when they see something not right. It is about having the understanding and having the confidence to stand up for what is right. So I don't know whether that answers the question. Very long-winded. Does that help at all, Amir?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Second ways.
Okay, great. Thanks, Phyllis. Sajar has the next question. She asks how to incorporate cultural competency component in the undergraduate training.
Okay, it's not easy because it's such a soft subject. So we in the beginning, when we did this work, it was hard to convince our curriculum, coordinator to let us take certain time out of the very busy medical curriculum to do workshops, because the CREST program that I have is actually a simulation training. We bring in culturally and linguistically diverse simulated patients for them to practice. But it is so important. So it is a lot of negotiations. But the university needs to value it, needs to understand the importance of this sort of teaching and need to make room for it. How do you incorporate? You make it happen. I don't know whether that helps. It's probably I just feel it's important. Until you recognize it, it will always be an uphill battle. So you just have to. They have to come to the play. They have to come together to play with you in order for it to be there. I think when you come together to design curriculum, it's good to get a few people of, I mean, it's very easy, in your environment to get a few people together, share some experiences, co-design your curriculum so that it fits in to everyone's need. A lot of this is unspoken. Because I come from Singapore, I know sometimes we're very used to a certain way of behavior from people that we don't recognize it for what it is. I think sometimes we need to point it out for what it is. So I hope that makes sense to you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, Saja. Okay, moving on to the next question, which is a question for you. He asks, have you observed any crossover effect from recent policy emphasis on equity, diversity, and inclusion measures in higher education and cultural competence? I'm wondering specifically if policy is able to influence the aspect of education.
Influence the aspect of being that absolutely. I don't know, is that what you mean? But more and more emphasis is put on equity. Is that what you mean? You call that the thinking now has become more and more into that. I don't know how to express it, into that higher level of thinking around diversity, and not just diversity in culturalism, diversity in other aspects of our life. For instance, the GLBTIQ sort of that sort of environment. So there's a lot of that, and yes, because of that thinking, that policy, it influenced us thinking more and more about the thinking, the being, rather than just the doing. Because doing is not the hard part, it's the thinking, changing our very inward thinking about what we need to do and what is the right thing to do. Is this what you mean? You call by the crossover effect, that because of policy change, therefore it impacts. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think that's helpful because you quoted politicians, and in Malaysia we generally do not quote politicians, but you're able to marry somehow the what the politicians say with that internal change, and I think that's very helpful today.
Thank you. Recently that word tolerance came again. I saw it in something from Singapore, and I thought, oh no, that word again. And it's a word still used very commonly today by I suppose by politicians in different countries. I think when we encounter things like this, we should question, why this sort of language. And I always said language is very important. Language is very important. How you name something, for instance, equality versus equity. I mean, I won't go into that. You all know that. Tolerance versus respect. Or acceptance. They are very different words, and yet politicians tend to dilute that what we regard as important as our very being into that sort of very passive thing. So when you hear things like that from politicians, whatever, I think it stimulates us to think. I mean, for us, in Australia, it's becoming more and more, people are becoming more and more sensitive to this cultural competence, the need to be inclusive. I'm not saying Australia is not at all, hasn't got its faults, but it's becoming more and more obvious, and people are very quick to speak up if they see something unfair.
Okay, we have another question for now.
One more.
You spoke about speaking up for what is wrong. How important is governance to cultural competence?
When you say governance, what do you mean governance? Do you mean our government response? Is that what you mean? Is it Nofal? Can you just clarify for me what you mean?
Sure. Sorry, it's Farin. I didn't log into my account. So
governance, not in terms of government, but for example, like more like in the policies, the policies of the organization, for example, like whistleblowing and all this that allows people to speak up.
I feel it's very important. I can't say it any more than that. It's very important. If your policy in your work environment encourage you to speak up when something is wrong, and not put the blame on the whistleblower, that is extremely important. I don't know whether in UM there is definitely protection. Well, in Western Sydney University and in Melbourne, there is definitely protection for whistleblower. We need them. We need whistleblower to of course, we're talking about real situation. We're not talking about any defamation or anything like that. We need people like that who is willing to put their heads on the chopping board to bring something to the surface. Like I said, thanks. I hope that answers your question. It's very important. A policy comes from the top, and it guides and advances the dissemination of the thinking. But from the ground to where you are, where I am, from the ground to let's do whatever we can, to speak up, to not join in. I think to not join in, because sometimes it's because we are in this. Because the environment that we're in is multicultural, and yet it's not a multicultural in a being sense. But because we all live together, doesn't mean that we are culturally competent in a multicultural society. Doesn't mean that everyone is culturally competent. So where you think that something is not supposed to be, don't join in. Sorry, I might be talking out of line here, but. So I did say that I'm going to share my own growth and my own journey.
Okay, I think that's about all the questions that we have for this. So thank you very much for your sharing your experience with us today, and I hope everyone benefited from this talk. Thank you, everyone.